Good morning. Let's get into our study today. We are trying to understand what God had written on the wall, the God who holds the destinies of men in his hands. And I want you to go with me, first of all, before we try and understand this writing, to two sections of scripture today. Proverbs chapter 16, verse 11 says, "Honest scales and balances are from the Lord. All the weights in the bag are of his making." It's interesting that when God assesses things, when God gives value to things, we hear here quite clearly that honest scales and balances are the scales and balances that God uses. The weights in the bag are of his making. That means very clearly that when God assesses the value of things or the results or the finality of something, God is always fair and honest. And as we said yesterday in our study, not only is God the creator, but he is going to be the judge. Not only is he the one who holds your life in his hand, who gives you life, but he's the one who's going to determine what is the value of your life. And when he does that, he always does it honestly. I also want you to notice that in Proverbs 20, God says there in verse 10, "Differing weights and differing measures, the Lord detests them both." It's interesting that when we look at these two sections of scripture, we find here very clearly that God does not like a dishonest tradesman, a dishonest businessman. God expects that a businessman will behave the same way that he has treated us, and that is in fairness. Now you might wonder why I'm doing all of this, but before we go any further, let's look at something else. In Daniel chapter 1, you know that Daniel and his three friends had been tested, and in verse 15 it says, "At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food." Then I want you to notice further that it says there in verse 17, "To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning." I want you to know who the source of their wisdom was, and that it was God. It then says further, "And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds." So particularly to Daniel, God had given the privilege and the gift of knowing how to interpret dreams and visions. In Daniel chapter 5, the queen mother, Nebuchadnezzar's wife, when she sees her grandson who is so dismayed, lying on a heap on the floor, pale as anything, she turns to him and says to him in verse 12 of Daniel chapter 5, "This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding and also ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems." Then she says, "Call for Daniel." Now remember, we found out that he does. He calls for Daniel. Daniel comes into his presence. Daniel says, "Yes, I can dream, I can read and understand and interpret the dream." Now let's get to the part. Now remember, one of the problems facing Belshazzar was that the writing on the wall, first of all, in the original language, the Aramaic, there are no vowels. Secondly, there was no separations, as I showed you in the previous video. So Daniel has to do something. He has to know the author of the writing on the wall. He has to know how this person puts words on the wall. And as we've just found out, Daniel does. So Daniel actually gives us the writing on the wall. He actually helps us to understand it by giving it to us. And it says there in verse 25, Daniel says, "This is the inscription that was written, many, many tekel, upharsin." Now, straight away we see here that Daniel has given the vowels, he's placed the separation between the words, and we now can better understand it. It's interesting that right here, Belshazzar, kind of the lights come on because he's a businessman. In actual fact, he was known to be quite a successful wool merchant. And he immediately knew that what these words meant as a businessman was that they were means of weighing. They were the means by which you would weigh off items sold. And so those weights will give value to the particular item sold. So let me explain. It's interesting that when you look at this, that the words many, many, which was actually the word for us to understand, the word mina, which was a form of currency, a weight, and it weighed 600 grams. Tekel, which was actually a shekel, weighed 10 grams. And Upharsin, which was basically a half a mina, weighed 300 grams. So these were weights and the description of weights that God had written on the wall. So at first glance, physically, this is what one gets. But don't always just stick there. Remember, God has a purpose, using things that we understand physically to teach us something that he wants us to understand from God's point of view. And that is not just the physical realm. So tomorrow we are actually going to see what these words actually meant that God had written on the wall. They weren't just physical scales. They had deeper symbolical meaning. And when we look at the things happening around us, although sometimes very physical, although earthquakes, although famines, although wars, the Bible teaches me that these are the beginning of birth pains. Somehow there is something else I'm supposed to learn from this. And may God help us to know how to read his handwriting. May God bless you today.